After delivering a speech clarifying his position on the war unfolding in Gaza, Starmer faced a question about whether or not Israel has to act in accordance with international law. And this was his reply.
It has to act in accordance with international law. This is not an optional extra and nice to have. It has to be in accordance with international law. And that is a point that we have repeatedly pressed on Israel, and other countries have pressed on Israel. It has to act in accordance with the law. As to whether each and every act is in accordance with the law, well, that will have to be adjudicated in due course. I think it's unwise for politicians to stand on stages like this or to sit in television studios and pronounce day by day which acts may or may not be in accordance with international law. I think it's not the role of politicians. I don't think it's wise to do it. I come with the benefit of a lawyer of having litigated about issues like this in the past. And in my experience, it often takes weeks or months to assimilate the evidence and to then work out whether there may or may not have been a breach of international law. So I think the call for politicians to look at half a picture on the screen without the full information and form an instant judgment as to whether it's this side of the line or the other side of the line is extremely unwise, and I'm not going to get involved in that kind of exercise.
Keir Starmer there holding a very clear line that it is not appropriate for politicians to call out war crimes as they happen. Instead, they should wait for the war crimes to finish and then adjudicate it in due course. Now, that's not always been Starmer's position. Here's a clip, and there always is a clip, of Starmer being asked the same question in March 2022 about Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
With your lawyer's hat on, is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
Yes.
Yes.
What I've seen already amounts to war crimes, particularly the awful attacks on civilians. And I think it's very important that he's held to account and is responsible. And all those that are acting with him know that they too will be held to account. And this is something which we need to make clear now so that those who are involved at the moment know what the consequences are. There's a gap that we've got to plug, and that is in relation to the aggression of the invasion. That is not something that at the moment can be dealt with by international tribunals, which is why I and others have suggested that we set up a tribunal to deal with this, a bit like the Nuremberg Tribunal, so that the act of aggression itself, the aggressive invasion that's going on, is itself something for which Putin and everybody who is acting with him can be held to account for.
There's not much more to add to that, is there? And for what it's worth, I agree with what he said in the Putin case. It's absolutely imperative, when there is clearly a good case to be made that war crimes are taking place, for the international community to mobilize to stop them. You don't wait until it's over, until the destruction has been wrought irreversibly, to do something about it. And when the General Secretary of the UN comes out and says that Israel has clearly violated international humanitarian law, when we know that food, water, aid is being blocked from entering Gaza, that constitutes pretty clear grounds for intervention. Ash, it's increasingly clear that Keir Starmer doesn't hold principles, he holds lines. And in this instance, where are his lines coming from?
That's not true, Dahlia. Keir Starmer holds principles. He holds many, many, many principles, which means that if you don't like these principles, he always has others. So I think you're being very unfair on our dear leader there. In terms of where's this particular line coming from, what explains it? I mean, first, you do have to talk about racism. I don't think that you would have this kind of hedging around the question of war crimes were Palestinians white. The fact that Palestinians are subject to anti-Arab racism, to Islamophobic racism, because of the particular way in which Israel interacts with European guilt over the Holocaust, I think that means that Palestinian lives are vastly devalued, right? It's like, okay, like 20 Palestinians, that equals one regular person. You know, maybe that's the going rate. And I don't think that you end up with that kind of devaluing of life without racism playing a part. But the second thing is that I think this demonstrates just has happened in terms of international law and the way in which it's been cheapened, because international law here is not meant to be some kind of universal framework to which every state is held accountable, whether they're considered in ordinary terms friend or foe. International law here is subject to the real politique of geopolitical interest. So international law, of course, it must apply to Russia. Of course, Russia must be held to the very highest standards. Let's get started on a Nuremberg tribunal now. Why? Well, there are very good reasons to hold Russia accountable for war crimes, but also it is geopolitically, strategically in the West's interest to weaken Russia. Why not hold Israel accountable to international law? Why not get a tribunal going now, gathering the evidence now, making a call on war crimes now to stop there from being further attacks on civilians while this war is being waged? Well, no, we wouldn't want to do that. That would be kind of like mean to Israel and, what kind of boys like that? Israel, it's like mini America, right slap bang in that difficult neighborhood of the Middle East where we've pissed off so many people. So just from a, very basic geopolitical point of view, neither the US nor its favorite cockapoo, the UK, would consider it in their interests to hold Israel to the same system of international law that we want to hold other states to, the states that strategically, for whatever reason, we want to weaken. Now, that is a very bad way to have international law being implemented or indeed understood. That is exactly what contributes to the breakdown of international law. And we've seen that over the last few weeks. One of the consequences of this sort of carte blanche being offered to Israel, in which international law gets a bit of lip service, but everybody knows that no one is serious about upholding it or making sure that anyone would be accountable for some of these war crimes which have been carried out in Gaza, and of course, as Amnesty have called out, it possibly in Lebanon as well. No one's actually serious about that. So you've got countries in the global south which have been, quite tentatively won round on the question of, reducing trade with Russia, contributing, in some small way to the Ukrainian war effort, turning around and going, hey, wait a minute, you told us this was about upholding international law. Now, you've just given this state carte blanche to drop tower blocks on children, and you're not going to do anything about it. Meanwhile, I've got to see my country's food and energy costs go up, not on your life. So it's a form of strategy which ultimately I think is self-defeating for the West. But, we didn't let that stop us during the war on terror. So why break the habit of a lifetime?